When we look at human rights, it is not always easy to see the impact of what we do. A meeting here, a conversation there, another report. What difference does it make on the ground? The 25th anniversary of the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples gives us a chance to step back and to look at the bigger picture, to see the progress made, the milestones reached, and find the motivation and energy we need for the next 25 years. On this exact date, 25 years ago, the UN Commission on Human Rights created the mandate. At that time, the word referred to indigenous people, not yet indigenous peoples. Mexican anthropologist Rodolfo Stavenhagen became the first special rapporteur. He helped shape the role of the mandate through country visits, thematic reports, and responses to allegations of violations. His work focused on land rights, poverty, structural discrimination, and the recognition of indigenous peoples, including in Africa and Asia. At that time, there was not yet a declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples. However, Stavenhagen called attention to the gap in implementation of human rights for indigenous peoples. Professor James Anaya became the next to hold the mandate. He took over a few months after the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which gave the mandate a clear normative framework. It also led to a renewed mandate explicitly directing the Special Rapporteur to promoting declaration. Professor Anaya made a tremendous contribution in advancing the interpretation of the declaration, especially the duty to consult indigenous peoples and obtain their free, prior, and informed consent, and carried out numerous country visits to all regions of the world to advance the implementation of the declaration, along with an overview of the situation of indigenous peoples in the Asian region. Within the UN system, he worked to build complementarity and coherence between the Special Rapporteur, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In 2014, Victoria Tauli Kopus became the first woman and the first indigenous person from Asia to hold the mandate. She brought a long-time experience of advocating for indigenous people's rights and focused on the operationalization of the UNSRIP. She placed indigenous people's rights firmly within global discussions of sustainable development, climate change, and biodiversity, and critically examined conservation policies and biodiversity initiatives that harmed indigenous communities. Vicky elevated global attention to criminalization and risks faced by indigenous human rights and environmental defenders, and tirelessly raised the situation of indigenous women. In 2020, Francisco Calitzei became the fourth special rapporteur in a particularly challenging time during the COVID-19 pandemic, and his first major report examined and highlighted the unequal impact of the crisis on indigenous peoples. He also continued scrutiny of conservation and climate-related policies and emphasized the rights of groups often overlooked, including urban and mobile indigenous peoples, indigenous persons with disabilities, and the situation of indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation or initial contact. Dr. Albert Barume assumed the mandate in January 2025 at a time of growing pressure on human rights and on multilateralism itself. His initial thematic focus has been on land rights and on the fundamental duty of states to recognize indigenous peoples. Given the pressure and risk of regression on indigenous peoples' rights, He focuses on bringing the mandate closer to Indigenous peoples, including through non-official visits to Indigenous communities and by establishing regional legal teams to help expand the operational capacity and impact of the mandate. His first official country visit to Botswana in 2025 noted a positive shift in government policy on Indigenous peoples, placing Botswana as a champion on Indigenous rights in the African region and beyond. The collective action of these 5 special rapporteurs leaves us with an impressive legacy developed over 25 years, 51 official country visits, and related reports that in detail analyze and provide recommendations on the human rights situation of Indigenous peoples in those countries, 62 thematic reports that provide in-depth analysis and contextual interpretation of Indigenous peoples' rights, more than 1,000 communications sent to governments, companies, and other duty bearers to raise concerns and demand accountability for human rights violations. So, what has changed over the past 25 years? Today, we have a declaration that sets the minimum standards for the rights of Indigenous peoples, which is authoritatively interpreted and broadly understood. The concept of Indigenous peoples with a right to self-determination is solidly anchored in international law, and Indigenous peoples in Africa and Asia are broadly recognized and fully part of the global Indigenous movement. Violations of Indigenous peoples' rights still persist, but Indigenous peoples know and demand their rights as recognized in international law, and they know how to use the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and other UN mechanisms to claim justice and demand accountability. This is the impact of 25 years of work and the foundation for the next 25.